ride or die.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about living donor assistance with finances. Our good friend and guest, Marie Claire Walters, is with us tonight. Marie Claire is the assistant coordinator of the National Living Donor Assistance Center. She has been working with the NLDAC or NALDAC team for 4 years. She's responsible for NALDAC's website contact newsletter and educational materials. She has worked on several pilot programs to expand the reach and the scope of this program. She's also very fluent in Spanish and provides dedicated support to Spanish-speaking donors, recipients, and trained professionals. The National Living Donor Assistance Center is a federally funded program that helps eligible living donors with their travel, lost wages, and dependent care expenses. This program is not intended to promote or encourage donation, however, and funds are not provided as a gift or reward for being a donor. Funding is only available to donors who cannot receive reimbursement of these costs from any of the following: the receipt of the organ, the recipient, any state compensation program under any insurance policy or under any federal or state health benefits program, or an entity that provides health services on a prepaid basis. Their mission is to reduce the financial disincentives to living organ donation. To this end, they operate a nationwide system that provides for reimbursement of travel, subsistence expenses, lost wages, and dependent care expenses to people being evaluated for and/or undergoing living organ donation. Priority is given to those who cannot otherwise afford to donate. From their website, quote, "Many people would like to donate an organ to a family member or friend, but would have the trouble paying for related expenses like transportation, lodging, food, and dependent care. These things are not covered by insurance, especially if they lose lost wages during the recovery from donation surgery. The cost of the process can be a burden for donors and recipients. For some, these costs might make it impossible for organ donation. The National Living Donor Assistance Center exists to provide access to transportation for those who want to donate but face financial barriers in doing so. This includes lost wages and of course, dependent care. This program is administered by the Division of Transportation, the Healthcare Systems Bureau, the Health Resources and Services Administration, United States Health and Human Services, to cooperation with the University of Kansas and the American Society of Transplant Surgeons. Please welcome Marie Claire Walters to the show. Start the show, Steve. Hi, Marie.
Hi, Jim. How are you? Thank you for
I'm
having
good.
me.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Happy to be here.
All right. In my introduction, did I state your credentials, your experience, and background information correctly, and the information about the National Living Donor Assistance Center?
Yes, it's all exactly right.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and what led you to the NLDAC.
Sure. So I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, which also happens to be the home of the NALDAC, which is what we call the National Living Donor Assistance Center. That's our acronym, NALDAC. And as a kid, I studied Spanish in school, and then I kept studying Spanish in college too. And after I graduated, I spent a couple of years in Chile as an English teacher. When I came back to the US, quite by chance, I found this position at NALDAC, and I've been here very happily ever since, which is about 4 years now, as you mentioned. It's been a great learning experience for me. When I applied for the job, I didn't have any connection to transplant, but it looked like a really meaningful thing to do, and that was what appealed to me about it.
Excellent. Excellent. Can you hear me, Marie?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Let's talk about the history of NALDAC. How was it founded? How has it changed over the years?
Yeah, so NALDAC was founded in 2006, and we received our first application in 2007. And for many years, about 14 years, NALDAC was a travel program. So we helped living donors with their transportation, their lodging, and their meals when they needed to travel to the transplant center. And that covers things like evaluation, and then it continues to follow them through the donation surgery if they go on to become donors, and their follow-ups up to 2 years after their surgery. But there were some other expenses that we were not authorized to cover with federal funding for many years. And toward the end of last year, the Secretary of HHS was able to authorize reimbursement of additional expenses through this program. And that allowed us to receive some additional funding and authorization to start helping living donors, not just with travel expenses, but also with lost wages and dependent care expenses that they may have during their recovery or just while they're attending their appointments. And the program has grown a lot over the years, especially in the last year or so since we started being able to help with lost wages. That's been a big help to a lot of people. We've distributed about $23 million so far just to donor expenses, and we've received over 12,000 applications from potential donors and actual donors.
Wow. Wow. Please describe for us the type of financial support that the center gives to living donors, including travel expenses, lost wages, and dependent care costs. Also, I understand there's a $6,000 limit per client.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So people apply to NALDAC when they are in the pre-surgery phase. So they can apply to NALDAC before their evaluation or right before their donation. And we can help them with travel expenses. So that includes transportation, lodging, and meals for the donor, and also for a support person. So somebody can go with them and provide moral and physical support, especially on the surgery trip and another trip. And that's often required by the transplant center. So that's our travel program, travel expenses for the donor and a support person. And then we also cover lost wages. So the lost wage reimbursement, that's meant to replace the wages that the donor would have earned if they didn't have to take time off, either to attend their appointments or during their recovery, which depending on, your anatomy and how your recovery goes and how physical your job is, you might be off work 4 to 6 weeks or longer or less time. Everybody's recovery is different, but a lot of people don't have enough paid leave to cover that time off work. So we cover up to 4 weeks of lost wages during recovery, in addition to 3 days for lost wages during the evaluation process, and then a day or two whenever you need to go back for follow-up appointments. And as you mentioned, the overall limit is $6,000.
Okay. Let's talk about the donors for a minute. How many donors can NALDAC help on a recipient's behalf at a time? Is there a maximum number, a minimum number? How does that work, Marie?
Yes. So like many transplant centers, we do one potential donor at a time. So for kidney recipients, we can do one donor at a time with a maximum of 3 potential donors receiving funding for a potential recipient. So often that corresponds with the transplant center policy. A lot of transplant centers do sort of one donor at a time, and if the first donor doesn't work out, they move on to a second donor. So NALDAC mirrors that policy too.
Okay, let's talk about the specific rules for travel expenses. I understand that NALDAC uses what they refer to as a value card rather than having people submit receipts for to be reimbursed. Can you explain how the travel expenses thing works?
Yes. So the travel reimbursement is our longest standing program, and we've got it down to a science. It runs really smoothly. One of the great things about this card is that donors don't have to pay out of pocket for these expenses and then send us the receipts and wait to be reimbursed. Instead, when the donors approve, we send them a special card. And from the donor's perspective, it looks and works just like a credit card. We make money available on the card, and the donor uses our card to reserve their hotel, pay for their meals, and whatever kind of transportation they need, plane tickets, gas, rental car, taxi. So the donor just swipes that card, and the bill comes to us for the card. They get a copy of the statement, but NALDAC pays those expenses on their behalf. And that way donors don't have to have any out-of-pocket expenses. NALDAC just pays those expenses in real time. And if there's anything left in the budget that they didn't need after their trip, we save it for them for another future trip. So those cards allow us to make it a little easier on donors who might not have the savings to go on a trip and pay out of pocket and then wait for reimbursement.
Okay. Can you discuss with us how lost wages are reimbursed and what limitations there are, if any?
Yes. So to receive the reimbursement of lost wages, the donor needs to be working for pay at the time of their appointment and losing that pay because they went to their appointment or because they took some time off work to be a donor, have their recovery, especially. That's the main one most people are worried about. And the reimbursement of lost wages comes to people in the same way that most workers receive their paycheck, which is direct deposit via ACH. So when the transplant center lets NALDAC know that the appointment or the donation surgery is complete, we send the money from our bank account to the donor's bank account, and it's usually their next business day, and the donor is free to spend it on their normal living expenses, whatever they normally spend their wages on.
Okay. How do you handle people that are self-employed or are independent contractors? How does that work?
That's a great question. So for people who are employees, it's really straightforward to calculate their wages. We just get their 2 most recent pay stubs or paychecks, and we calculate an average. But if you're self-employed, you might not have the pay stubs. Most people who are self-employed don't write themselves paychecks. So for people who are self-employed, we have several options. We try to be flexible and accommodating with this. Most people who are self-employed submit an attachment to their tax return that's called Schedule C, and that's a profit and loss statement from a small business. So we can use that to calculate their average wages over the course of a year. We can also use a 1099. A lot of people who are independent contractors will receive a 1099 form from the company they did contract work for. We can use that too. Another option is people work for a company like Uber or Instacart as an independent contractor. They should be able to log on to that company's website or app and print out a statement of their earnings generated by the company, and we can use that too. So if anybody who is self-employed has any questions about the best way to document their wages, we invite them to call us. We try to be really accessible. Our office is open 9 to 5 Eastern time, Monday through Friday. You can email us or call us, and we would be happy to help you identify the right way to document your wages if you're self-employed.
Okay, let's talk about this fact. You have to be working for pay at the time that you request reimbursement. If you're somebody that is unemployed or furloughed, or you're getting cash under the table, or you have some kind of long-term or short-term disability benefits, it's my understanding that reimbursement is not available to you through NALDAC. Is that a fair statement?
Part of it, yes, but there's one exception. So if you're unemployed or you're furloughed, maybe you're a stay-at-home parent or you're retired, for whatever reason you're not working for pay, then you wouldn't be able to receive wage reimbursement because you wouldn't be losing wages during your recovery because of the donation. However, you mentioned short-term disability and paid time off. So probably a little less than half of people who apply to this program for wage reimbursement have some sort of benefit through their employer, maybe paid time off, maybe short-term disability, but they're still welcome to apply for wage reimbursement because often those types of wage continuation or benefits from their employer don't cover everything for them. So for example, it's really common for a short-term disability policy provided through an employer to cover 60 or 65 or maybe 70% of somebody's normal wages. So the donor is still losing wages. It's not all of their wages, but maybe they'd like to have that 30% that they're not getting from short-term disability. So we'd be happy to help them with that. So for example, if someone has short-term disability, it's going to cover 60% of their wages. Now that could cover the other 40% so that they don't suffer a loss, even though they have some support through their employer. And the same thing for paid time off. Maybe you have a week of paid time off, but that's not going to cover your whole recovery. So we could cover the rest for you.
Okay, let's talk about dependent care expenses. What is dependent care? Who's included? Are there any limitations? And how are donors reimbursed?
Right. So the dependent care reimbursement is also sent by direct deposit. So it goes to the donor's bank account. And our goal with the dependent care program is to pay donors back for the dependent care expenses they have because of being a donor. So an example of a dependent care expense might be getting a babysitter to watch your kids that you usually care for. But during your recovery, you're not allowed to lift anything that's more than 10 pounds for a couple weeks. So if you're the primary caregiver to children, you might need to hire a babysitter, for example, to come watch your kids, either during your recovery or maybe just during your appointments so you can go in peace to your evaluation or your follow-up trips. Another example of dependent care we can cover would be care for an elderly person. So the average age for a donor who applies to NALDAC is in the early 40s, and 60% of NALDAC applicants are women. So this is a group of people who do a lot of caregiving. Many of them care for young children. Some of them care for elderly parents or a disabled adult. So any of those types of people, children, disabled adults, or elderly people, can be dependents of the donor. And if the donor needs to get somebody to watch their dependent while they're busy recovering or attending their appointments, we can help with that. We can provide up to $420 a week per child for childcare and up to $504 a week for care of an adult that the donor normally cares for. And it doesn't have to be a babysitter. If you care for somebody who is not a child, they might need home health aid, or your kids might need extra hours at daycare, or maybe you'd like grandma and grandpa to come watch your kids while you're busy recovering and you want to pay for their plane ticket or their gas money. So those are all types of things that we could cover as dependent care. We know everybody's going to have slightly different dependent care solutions, so we try to keep that reimbursement as flexible as possible.
Okay, and there's an attestment requirement too. Can you discuss that a little bit, Marie-Claire?
Yes. So if you apply to NALDAC, there's one page in the application that's called the attestation. And this is just a fancy word that means you promise, you solemnly say. And there are a couple purposes of this page. On that form, we make sure that the donor and the recipient understand that you can't buy or sell any organs, so that they're in compliance with a law called the National Organ Transplant Act. When they sign that form, they're also allowing the transplant center to share information about them with NALDAC, because the transplant center needs their permission to provide information about them to this other organization. And they also attest that they are not receiving, so they solemnly say that they are not receiving reimbursement of these expenses from another source. There are a couple other programs that may be able to help donors. And so we just want to make sure that if the donors, got their travel covered through another program, that we're not providing that assistance again. We might help the donor with lost wages and dependent care, but just not double up on the same assistance that's already covered for them through another source. So those are the three purposes of that form called the attestation form in the application.
Okay, good. On your website, you say about 70% of the households are eligible for help. What are the standards for eligibility? What determines eligibility, and how does this work? When do you file to become eligible? Give us some idea of how that process works?
Yeah, so it's best for people who are considering donation to apply early. You don't have to wait until you're certain you're going to be a donor. We recommend people apply before their evaluation. And if that doesn't work out, they can apply before their surgery. But the application needs to be approved before the donation surgery takes place. So you want to make sure you get this set up early in the process if possible. And then eligibility for this program has a couple elements. The basic ones are that the donor and the recipient both need to be either U.S. citizens or lawfully present residents. And they also need to have their primary residence in the U.S. This program cannot pay for international travel. So citizens or lawfully present residents have their primary residence in the U.S. And then the main one is that the recipient's household income should be below a certain limit. And that limit is different depending on the recipient's household size. And the reason the recipient's household income should be below a certain limit is when this program was authorized by Congress, the law was written in a way that said we can only provide federal funding to donors for these expenses if the donor can't receive assistance with them from 3 other sources. So insurance companies, state compensation programs, and the recipient of the organ. So I think we're all familiar with the prohibition on buying and selling organs. Whenever you go to the transplant center, you're going to learn the first thing that, you can't pay someone to be your donor. But the National Organ Transplant Act also said right after it prohibits the buying and selling of organs that it's fine to reimburse donors for their expenses. And anybody is allowed to do that, even recipients. So it's fine for a potential transplant recipient to help the donor with their transportation, their lodging, their meals, even lost wages and dependent care. Those things are all reimbursable. And recipients are allowed to do that. Unfortunately, many people who need a kidney transplant or a liver transplant, any kind of living donor transplant, they're often too sick to work and they're already having a lot of financial hardship. So often they're just in no position to help their donor, even if they would like to do that. So NALDAC was created to help those low to moderate income people who are hoping to get a living donor transplant, get their donor where they need to go and make the process a little bit easier for their donors. So that's why it's the recipient's household income that primarily affects eligibility.
Okay, it's my understanding that the people that can apply for assistance, any living donor, as long as the costs aren't coming to be reimbursed by the recipient, a state program, or insurance company. Is that a correct understanding?
Pretty much, yes. But don't be discouraged if there is a state program or an insurance company that provides some assistance. There may still be something now that can do for you or your donor. For example, Iowa is the only state that has a state compensation program. And the Iowa State Compensation Program covers travel expenses, but it doesn't cover lost wages or dependent care. So somebody who lives in Iowa could still apply to NALDAC for help with lost wages and dependent care and just go to Iowa for travel expenses. And a similar thing is true for people with an insurance benefit. Sometimes the recipient's insurance has a travel benefit for the donor, but usually it doesn't cover everything that NALDAC does. So if there is a benefit, they need to use that benefit. For example, maybe the recipient's insurance will cover the cost of the hotel, but they don't cover transportation or meals. So the donor could apply to NALDAC for help with what's not covered with the insurance benefit. And then you said any living organ donor. As a slight caveat on that, we can help solid living donors of solid organs. So no bone marrow donors are eligible, but you could be a kidney donor, a liver donor. Sometimes we see uterus donors. And in the past, there were also occasionally intestine donors and lung lobe donors, but that doesn't really happen anymore in the US. So any solid organ donor is welcome to apply.
What steps does NALDAC take to prevent fraud? Our good friend Jonathan Traylor is asking a question in the comments.
Yeah, so we generally find that living organ donors are very honest people. We don't have much trouble with ne'er-do-wells applying to NALDAC. We do have some controls in place to ensure that the federal funding is spent appropriately. For example, on the travel cards, there are certain restrictions. The travel cards only work if you swipe them at merchants that have to do with travel. So if somebody got confused, or somebody took a donor's card and tried to swipe it at, say, a clothing store or a tourist attraction, the card wouldn't work there. Another control we have on the program is that the applications are submitted by transplant centers. And the transplant center is only going to take the time to submit an application to NALDAC if this is somebody who they really think they're going to evaluate, or they really think they're going to do surgery on. People can't apply to NALDAC without a transplant center facilitating the application for them. So that ensures that anybody we hear from in terms of receiving an application has a transplant center that considers them a credible potential donor and somebody we should assist.
Okay.
Looks like we have a question there. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any limit to the distance that one can travel within the United States or a territory of the United States and still be reimbursed?
There is no distance limit, and there's also no minimum distance. Sometimes people wonder, well, maybe I'm not eligible for travel assistance because I only live half an hour or 1 hour from the transplant center. But there is no minimum distance. So even if it's not a huge distance, if the donor is concerned about their travel expenses, we would be happy to get their application. So you can travel as far as you need or as little as you need, as long as it's within the U.S. and its territories, places like Puerto Rico and Guam, in addition to the 50 states. We would be happy to help.
Okay. Talk to us a little bit about how eligibility is determined. What are the criteria, and whose income are you looking at? This struck me as a little bit different maybe than some other agencies' criteria.
Yes, and that's a good point. A lot of people, when they first hear that it's the recipient's household income that affects eligibility, are a little surprised. As I mentioned, there's this law that requires us to assess the recipient's ability to help their donor if they're able to. So this federal assistance is really there for low and moderate income transplant recipients to have a better chance at getting a living kidney donor transplant or a living liver donor transplant, depending on what they need. So the main factor in eligibility is the recipient's household income. And the income guidelines are set at 350% of the federal poverty guidelines. But I'll give you some examples so you can know exactly what that means, because I wouldn't expect most people to be familiar with exactly what those are. So the federal poverty guidelines are a measure of income in the US. They're updated every year in response to things like inflation and cost of living. And for a household of four, the federal 350% of the federal poverty guidelines, so the NALDAC limit, is about $93,000 a year. And it's a little lower if you have a smaller household, and it's higher if you have a larger household, because there are more people to support with that income. So if you go to our website and on the How to Apply menu, click on the eligibility guidelines, you can see a chart that shows exactly what the maximum household income is for households of all different sizes. So for a household of two, for example, like a married couple or a single parent and child, the recipient's household income could be about $61,000 a year. If you have a family of six, it could be up to $124,000 a year. Even if the recipient's household income is a little bit above our guidelines, there's a way for them to still qualify, or for their donor to still qualify. We consider many types of financial hardship. So we know that if you're sick enough to need a kidney transplant or a liver transplant, you probably have a lot of medical expenses, and you may have a lot of travel expenses associated with those medical events too. For example, a lot of times when you get a kidney transplant, if you don't live near the transplant center, you have to relocate there for a couple months so you can go to all your appointments. And that can be really expensive. So if the recipient's household income is above our guidelines, but not by a ton, just by a bit, like a couple $1,000s, it's very likely that their donor might still apply. We can consider lots of types of financial hardship, mostly related to the medical condition. So any kind of insurance premiums that you pay for medical insurance, co-pays right now and in the future after your transplant, travel expenses related to medical expenses, medical needs, those can all be subtracted from the recipient's household income, and their donor may qualify that way, even if they're a little bit over the limit. So even if you see you're a little bit over the limit, don't be too discouraged. Your donor might still qualify.
Okay. How does the center define a household. When I look at the definition in your FAQs, it says a household is defined as persons living alone or a group of people living together. They do not have to be related. Under this definition, a person who lives with others but who lives independently and shares basic living expenses like roommates can be a separate household. Can you tell us how that works, please?
Absolutely. So when we talk about households, really what we're thinking of is the people you would imagine being on your tax return. So if you're married, your spouse is going to be part of your household. If you have dependent children, like children under 21, they'd be part of your household too. So generally it's family members you live with, but it's also possible for there to be people in the same house as you, the same physical building, who are not part of your household. Like you gave the example of roommates. You wouldn't file taxes together with your roommate, so we wouldn't consider your roommate to be part of your household.
Okay, let's talk about the kind of donors that are eligible. A non-directed donor, someone who is donating an organ without choosing a recipient or knowing who's going to receive it. How does NALDAC work with those people?
Yeah, so we got some good news about this last year when the program expanded, and we were able to make it a lot easier for non-directed donors. So just for everybody in the audience, in case they're not aware, a non-directed donor is somebody who wants to be a living organ donor, but does not have an intended recipient. So they don't really know anyone who needs a transplant. They just want to be a living donor. They're comfortable with the transplant center deciding who should receive it. So non-directed donors, because they don't have a recipient in mind, there's no recipient who could help them with travel expenses or lost wages or dependent care. They don't have a recipient who could help them with those expenses. So they are pretty much eligible for NALDAC. We don't have a limit on donor income, and there's no recipient to be over income. So as long as a non-directed donor is a U.S. citizen or lawfully present resident, and they have their primary residence here in the U.S., they just need to apply on time and their application is going to be approved.
Okay. How does it work with people that are involved in a paired exchange, a donor swap?
That's a great question.
How does NALDAC work with those folks?
Yeah, because if you think about it, if you're in a swap or a chain, there's sort of two recipients that you might feel connected to. There's the person you started doing this to help, the recipient you know, but you're not compatible with. And then there's also that stranger that you are paired with and who actually receives your kidney. So the person you would apply to NALDAC with and whose household income and other factors determine eligibility for the donor is that originally intended but incompatible recipient. It's the recipient you know and you got into the chain to help. That's the person who should be listed on the application when you apply to NALDAC.
Okay. One of the things that's a little tricky about this for people to understand is who actually submits the application to NALDAC. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that works, please?
Sure. So if you want to apply to NALDAC, you can start the process by yourself. You can go to our website and print out the application worksheets. But when it's time to submit the application, the donor's transplant team will need to do that on your behalf. So a couple people might do that, but it's going to be somebody on the donor's transplant team at the hospital. So often it's the donor's social worker. It might also be the donor's nurse coordinator. It could be the independent living donor advocate, or it could be the financial coordinator. Any of those people would be in a great position to submit the NALDAC application on your behalf. And those transplant professionals have an account on our website, and they just log in and they enter the information you wrote on the worksheets for them, and they submit the application. So your donor's transplant team will submit the application on your behalf.
Okay. Let's talk about timeliness.
Mm-hmm. When
should the application be submitted to NALDAC? You guys must need some lead time, right?
Yes, the sooner the better. And that's good for us because it gives us plenty of time, but it's also good for donors because NALDAC covers expenses that the donor has after their application is approved. So ideally, if possible, the donor should apply before their evaluation so we can help them on their evaluation trip. Because if they only apply after the evaluation, they're going to have some out-of-pocket expenses from when they went to that evaluation. We'd be able to help with future expenses, but whatever happened before the application was approved, that would be an out-of-pocket expense for them. And if they'd applied earlier, we could have helped them with it. So we always encourage people to apply early. Generally, when we receive an application, We look at it right away. We make sure it's complete. If anything's missing, we get in touch with the transplant professional who submitted it. We get it complete. And then when the application is ready for review, we usually have a decision for people within 2 weeks or 10 business days. And we collect all the applications that are ready for review on Monday morning. And then by Wednesday, our review committee provides a decision and we start calling all the donors that are approved. So you'll be hearing from us probably in the latter half of the week after you submitted your application with a decision to say your application has been approved. But the earlier, the better.
Okay. We talked a little bit about this attestation form. Please explain why both the living donor and the recipient must sign the attestation form.
Sure. So that's the form that allows the transplant center to transmit information to us. It's also a form that in which the donor and the recipient say they're in compliance with relevant legislation and they're not receiving this reimbursement from another source already. So we need that from both the donor and the recipient. Make sure we're all in compliance with relevant legislation, that the transplant center can provide us the information we need and that that's authorized. Health information is protected under HIPAA. And so the transplant center wouldn't release that information to us unless the donor and the recipient specifically authorized it. So for those reasons, they both need to sign the form. And if they have any questions about it, we encourage them to call us. We'd be happy to walk them through it.
Okay. Where does the center's funding come from? We talked a little bit about this in the introduction. Where does all the money come from?
Yes. So as you can imagine, it takes a fair amount of money to run a program this big, and that just provides grants to living organ donors. So NALDAC is generously funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration. We call them HRSA for short. That's their acronym. And HRSA is part of HHS or part of HHS, and so that's part of the federal government. So Congress provides funding to HRSA, and HRSA distributes some of that funding to NALDAC. HRSA also funds several other important organizations in the transplant realm, like UNOS and SRTR. So NALDAC is one of those projects funded by the government through HRSA.
Okay. If I receive assistance from NALDAC and my state allows for a tax deduction for donor expenses, may I still claim a deduction for the expenses you guys are reimbursing me for?
You could not do that because, so as you mentioned, some states have a deduction or a credit to help people offset their out-of-pocket expenses if they become a living organ donor. If NALDAC has paid all your expenses as a donor and you don't have any out-of-pocket expenses, then you didn't have any expenses. There's nothing for your state to pay you back for. So if NALDAC covered all your expenses, you should not ask your state for a tax credit or deduction for any expenses NALDAC paid on your behalf, because you never paid those things. NALDAC took care of it for you. However, a lot of donors, as I mentioned earlier, they only apply to NALDAC once they're done with their evaluation, unfortunately. So some donors have a little bit of out-of-pocket expenses that NALDAC didn't cover before they applied. So if you've had any out-of-pocket expenses as a donor, you're welcome to report those on your state income tax return and receive a credit for them. But if NALDAC covered everything for you, you shouldn't report anything NALDAC paid on your behalf.
What happens if I use some of the funds from NALDAC and I'm unable to donate? Something goes wrong in the testing. There's an act of God, a major storm, a hurricane, other unforeseen events outside of my control.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So that's quite common. We know that a big chunk of people who are interested in being evaluated as a living donor for various reasons don't end up becoming living donors. And that's fine. That's just part of the process that we understand. So about between 50 and 60% of people who apply to NALDAC go on to become a donor, and the rest don't, and that's fine. So we are happy to have paid for their evaluation expenses if we covered that. If you receive NALDAC funding, but in the end, you can't become a donor, you don't want to become a donor for whatever reason you don't proceed, that's fine. If you proceeded in good faith, NALDAC is happy to have provided assistance whenever we did, and you just wouldn't receive funding for any future appointments that don't take place.
Okay. One of the things that I noticed in your FAQs was there was conversation about a deferral process. And it's my understanding that NALDAC has never, ever to date had to use the deferral process. Can you explain what the deferral process is and why NALDAC's never had to use it?
Sure. So the fact that we've never had to use it is great news. That means there's plenty of funding for everybody who's eligible and applies. So we are very far from ever having to use the deferral process. The deferral process is part of a contingency plan that we created when the program expanded. Last year, the program expanded very dramatically. A lot of additional funding was available, but we weren't sure how many people would apply, how many people would be eligible, how much money we would need for everything, because the expanded program covered a lot more than the historical program that we were more familiar with. So we wanted to make sure that we had a plan in place to prioritize the neediest donors, the lower income donors. If so many people applied to NALDAC that we didn't have enough funding for everybody who's eligible. So right now, if you apply to NALDAC, you're going to get a straightforward yes or no answer on whether or not you're eligible and your application is approved. But if it ever happened that we received a lot of applications from people who were eligible, but there were not enough funding for all those eligible applicants, we would prioritize funding for the neediest donors. We would prioritize the lower income donors for funding, and people with a higher income would be deferred. And that would mean, yes, you're eligible, but unfortunately there's no funding right now. We'll get back to you if that ever changes. But as I say, happy to report we have never had to use that. Currently, the program is very generously funded, and so we would love to get more applications. We do not have to defer any applications right now.
It's my understanding, Marie Claire, that the initial downstroke that you guys were given by HRSA was in excess of $8 million. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes.
Wow,
so there's plenty of funding for donor expenses, and we want as many donors who are interested to apply. So we are very much encouraging applications. We want to deliver this money to make living donor transplants possible.
Okay, our friend Kathy's asking a question. What if people have to travel thousands of miles to donate, and maybe they come up against or they exceed the $6,000 maximum? How does that work?
So the $6,000 maximum is written into the federal eligibility guidelines. So unfortunately, we don't have any flexibility on the $6,000 limit. No matter the distance, $6,000 is the upper limit on what anyone can receive through the program. So if donors think they're going to have more than $6,000 of travel expenses, for example, we were talking about mileage, they might be able to find cheaper accommodation, or maybe they could stay in like a place that had a kitchen and their support person could cook rather than spending money on hotels. We find
Ronald
that
McDonald House.
Yeah, like a Ronald McDonald House. Yeah. There are also some sort of extended stay hotels that might have cooking facilities. So it can be expensive to travel for 2 weeks, 2 people, to an expensive coastal city like New York City or San Francisco, where lodging is expensive. But usually we find that $6,000 is you can squeeze a trip into $6,000 if you're fairly resourceful. The times when $6,000 is not always sufficient is when the donor requests more than one type of assistance. So it's pretty common for a donor between lost wages and travel expenses to be able to use more than $6,000. And when that happens, because unfortunately we can't provide more than $6,000, we just have a conversation with the donor about what's most important to them, and we make sure that's covered. So for example, some donors want to make sure they have a certain amount in lost wages just to cover their basic living expenses during their recovery, and then they'll dedicate the rest to travel. Or they want to make sure all their travel expenses are covered and whatever's left is going to lost wages. So we just talk about what's important to them, and we make sure that's prioritized.
Okay. Is there anything that you would like to mention that I forgot to ask about, or you would like to mention before we conclude our discussion this evening?
I think I'd just like to encourage people to mention this program when they talk about living donation. NALDAC exists to make living donor transplant possible for people like the people I imagine are watching this broadcast. So if you're looking for a living kidney donor, I encourage you to visit our website and check the eligibility guidelines. You can compare your household income to the income we allow. And if it's within that, it's a little bit above. I really encourage you, when you're talking about your search for a living donor, to let people know that there is support so that that can affect their decision making. And if they're worried about travel expenses, if they're worried about lost wages, they can know that there may be support for them and that they can apply for that.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking time to talk with us, Marie. Thank you very much. It's been an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be
Oh,
here.
no worries. No worries. Thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, upcoming broadcasts on November 5th. I really have something special for you. We're going to talk with Dr. Sigal Patel, who is a medical doctor and researcher in nephrology. She's also a kidney and pancreas transplant recipient. So lots of ground to cover. A doc that's actually one of us should be interesting. November 26th, we're going to talk with the great Austin Lee, tremendous kidney advocate. In particular, his specialty is with pediatric kidney patients. So if you're interested in peds, children, you have a soft spot in your heart for children like your Uncle Jim, be sure you check us out with Austin. I have an open date the first Friday of December. The last Friday of December is December 31st, New Year's Eve. No program that night. Uncle Jim's giving you the night off. So watch this space, my friends. Interesting things going on. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.